Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm Costain. A new report by IPES Food has found that food systems are routinely overlooked in climate negotiations and national climate plans, despite food systems contributing significantly to global greenhouse gas emissions and to biodiversity collapse. However, the report, From Plate to Planet, finds that national governments need to look no further than the pioneering strategies of their own cities and regions to transform food systems. Nicole Pita is one of the report's authors and a project manager for IPES Food. I asked her what cities and regions are doing that national governments are not.
I would say, in a few words, cities and regions are using food system transformation to not only draw down greenhouse gas emissions, but to sustainably nourish their communities. We know that food systems are responsible for a third of greenhouse gas emissions, and that without far-reaching and urgent action to transform food systems, it will be impossible to meet our climate targets. Yet, national governments have not prioritized food system transformation, and certainly not in their climate strategies. In our report From Plate to Planet, we looked at the nationally determined contributions that countries have made to try and meet the Paris Agreement target of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And in those nationally determined contributions, there are mentions to transitioning to sustainable farming practices, which is certainly welcome. Sometimes mentions of reducing food loss and waste, but really no mention of shifting diets to sustainable, healthy diets. And no country is taking action across the entire food system in a linked up manner. And that's exactly what city and regional governments are doing. They are also making sure that the climate crisis is being treated as the crisis that it is. I think it's only 18 national governments and the European Union have declared a climate emergency. Over 2,300 local and regional governments have done so. And that really accelerates action to meet the Paris Agreement target. And it opens up funding streams. And that's included a lot of food policies, food and climate policies that cities and regions are implementing. And they're really making a concerted effort to make sure that those food policies target all areas of the food system. So they're protecting farmland. They're helping farmers transition to organic agriculture. They're making sure that sustainable, healthy diets are accessible and are affordable and are desirable for their residents. And they're cutting down on food loss and waste. And those programs are really working because they're making sure that they're setting measurable, robust targets. They're collaborating across government departments, and they're bringing in a lot of food system stakeholders in those actions.
It's really interesting to hear what you say. And I'm interested in that element around emissions, because emissions has always felt like it's quite difficult and nebulous to sort of pin down within the system, especially when you're getting beyond a food manufacturing plant and down into the fields themselves. And I think from a national government perspective, there has been this tendency to not quite really understand the way that emissions work within food systems and to leave it to businesses to sort out for themselves. Now, the Global Alliance for the Future of Food has recently brought out a new report which shifts the focus towards fossil fuels rather than emissions. And I wonder if you think that might help to create a more understandable narrative, a more clear narrative for national governments to act on food systems.
I think certainly. And I think actually it opens our eyes to new areas of waste and mismanagement that we hadn't been focusing on before. Because for me, one of the biggest findings from that report is that the biggest, fossil fuel user in the food system is actually coming from processing and packaging food. So it's not actually in the production stages, it's not in the waste, it's in that processing, like middle stage. I didn't know that before. And I think that will focus more attention on those really highly processed foods, which I know attention has been increasing about them and their health impacts, but now we can look at how they're addicted to fossil fuels and keeping us on this fossil fuel trajectory.
It also picked up, didn't it, on the fossil fuel use in terms of chemical pesticides?
Yes, that's right. I think some people know, but I think most people don't know that chemical pesticides and chemical fertilizers are derivatives of fossil fuels, of fossil gas primarily. And because our energy sector and our transportation sector are pretty quickly weaning off of fossil fuels. Fossil fuel companies are trying to find new outlets for oil and gas, and agrochemicals is one of them. It's really becoming a growth sector for the fossil industry, that and plastics as well. So we really need to be more careful. And us in the food world who maybe weren't paying attention to anti-fossil fuel campaigns or looking at fossil fuel build out and development can start to look at that now with this report. And hopefully we can start to join hands, really work together with anti-fossil fuel campaigners. And I hope that those are conversations that come out of this report.
It's hugely concerning to hear the way that you talk about fossil fuel companies. They're shifting their attention and their profit-making model away from transport and energy and now towards targeting food systems. Now, the big supermarket model where most people buy their food in the developed world is fossil fuel reliant and often promotes unhealthy meals. Are the regional food systems that you've seen better able to support healthy diets for the poorest and the most vulnerable in our societies rather than simply the middle classes?
I've really looked at how local governments, cities, and regions are trying to strengthen and build out their regional food systems, really keeping food within their food sheds. And one of the first steps that many of them do is actually looking at, okay, what is our food shed? Like, where is the food coming from that we're consuming? How much of it is locally produced? How much of it is organic? How much comes from smallholder farmers? So that's one of the first steps that a lot of local governments are taking. And then next, what a lot of them do are building up food hubs, places where these local producers can bring together their local produce and hopefully bid then for bigger public procurement bids. So the city then facilitates that action to make sure that that local produce gets into schools, hospitals, senior centers, and other public canteens. And then some cities in the United States are actually allowing federal meal vouchers. So in the US, these are called SNAP or WIC federal benefits to buy food. They're letting folks use those in farmers markets to buy local produce. And some cities even go even farther and they say, and if you use those meal vouchers in our farmers markets, we'll double the value of them. So that's really going quite a long way. That's, I think, New Haven, Connecticut is doing that right now.
Now, we talk a lot, particularly in the UK at the moment, about land use frameworks, trying to take a more strategic approach to land that takes account of food production, but also forestry and nature and amenity. But it sounds like that mapping work that you mentioned is a really important building block along the way, and that there's perhaps a danger that without that mapping work, we might actually end up creating more challenges than we solve.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, food systems are incredibly complex and they're impacted by climate and the biosphere. Soil degradation is a huge issue. Biodiversity decline is a huge issue in the food system. If we don't know what the challenges are that we have to deal with, where are the biodiversity hotspots, for example, what areas are really being hit by climate impacts? Where are our local farmers and where are they struggling? And are they getting their food into local markets? Is there that kind of distribution chain available? If we don't map that out, then we won't be able to prioritize actions. And there are always trade-offs in the actions that we take, and we need to be wise to them.
Can you give us some examples of cities and regions that are leading the way?
Yes, yeah. The first one that comes to mind now that we're talking about farmland and farmland protection is surprisingly São Paulo, Brazil. You might not think that one of the biggest cities in the world is actually protecting farmland, but they're a leader in farmland protection. So in the rural districts that are really on the outskirts of the city, they're protecting forests and farmland from urban development because that city obviously is continuously growing. So what they've done is help those farmers that are in those areas to transition to organic agriculture. And then they've helped them to get that local produce into schools, into public procurement systems. So they're finding buyers for their local organic produce. And those areas, because it's in São Paulo, that's where the Atlantic forest is, the Mata Atlântica. And that's the most threatened biome in Brazil right now. So it's really important that, especially the city, that's one of the biggest pressures on that forest is protecting it. Then I would say it's it's important to produce food sustainably, but it's also equally important to make sure that it'll be eaten by consumers. So shifting diets to sustainable, healthy diets is incredibly important. And there's a lot of research that shows that if we shift to sustainable diets and if we reduce industrial meat production and consumption, we can cut greenhouse gas emissions by 8% globally, which is huge. That's massive. And that comes along, again, when we talk about like trade-offs and added benefits and synergies, that comes with health benefits, that comes with reducing pressures on land and ecosystems. And a lot of cities, you know, while national governments are reluctant to get into these culture wars and food, you know, veggie burger debates, cities and regions are leading the way. And there's a town in France that's a real leader in establishing integrated food policies. That means that they're targeting producers and consumers and retailers and the public procurement sector through a number of integrated food policies. And through their efforts, they've been able to impact 60% of their residents who now say, they now say, look, we're eating less meat, we're eating less highly processed foods, we're eating more seasonal and organic produce because of the efforts that this city has undertaken. And that's actually resulted in a 19% emission reduction in the town.
Now, policy, certainly in the UK, has always been very top down. Do you think that national governments are becoming any better at learning from the bottom up from their cities and regions?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I think overall, no, but there are some exceptions to that. It's, let's say, related to the food system. In France, there was a program recently called Territorial Food Project, and that was led by local governments, really local governments saying, okay, we want to support farmers, we want to shorten supply chains, and we want to put more of the local organic produce into public canteens. And so many of them signed on to this program, these territorial food projects, that the national government started to pay attention and started to support the program as well. So that's really encouraging. But that's kind of the exception, not the rule. And I think when it comes to climate, we have this really big gap where national governments are really held to account and their emissions are counted through the nationally determined contributions, but local actions aren't measured and counted as part of those nationally determined contributions. So there have been efforts led by local authorities in the UK, actually, to create locally determined contributions, where we're actually measuring what local governments are doing to draw down carbon emissions and counting those towards nationally determined contributions. And that's a way to really recognize and support the work that local governments are doing on climate action. But that's still not come to fruition, and really much more needs to be done.
I wonder whether you think that there may actually be a challenge around the way that nationally determined contributions have made national governments focus sometimes disproportionately on emissions, which has led sometimes to distorting action in terms of food systems. Whereas without that same pressure on cities and regions, they've been able to think more broadly and creatively and actually achieve more joined up food system approaches.
Absolutely. I think what local governments are really leaders in is that they have an ear to the ground. They have really close connections to their residents and to their landscapes. And so that makes it so local governments are really food policy innovators and implementers in a way that's difficult for national governments to do, to have those close connections. So what they should be doing is really supporting what local governments are already doing. That would really scale up the work that those cities and regions are doing, sometimes with really very little recognition and resources and support, and also scale it out to other cities and regions.
That was Nicole Pita from IPES Food. More news on our website, 8point9.com. That's all for now. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.